Thousands of years ago, when a crime was committed in Rome, the judges would ask one question, qui bono, or who stands to gain, who profits? And when we look at 9/11, the answer is clear. Let's look at what the Bush family was doing in the days before 9/11 and on 9/11, and it's quite revealing. Marvin Bush was in New York City running security for the World Trade Center complex. Former President Bush was in D.C. at the Ritz-Carlton for a Carlyle Group function, sitting at the head table with the head of the bin Laden family. 2 days before 9/11, Governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, declared unprecedented martial law in Florida. He didn't make the announcement until September 11th. Then we have the CIA-controlled head of Pakistani intelligence, General Ahmad Ahmed, arriving in Washington, D.C. on September 13th, just days after he wired, the New York Times admits, $100,000 to the supposed lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta. For the week he was here, preceding 9/11, he met with CIA Director George Tenet, the heads of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, Porter Goss and Senator Graham. By the way, Porter Goss has now been made head of the CIA. On the morning of 9/11, he was actually having breakfast with Senator Bob Graham and Porter Goss. What is the money man behind Mohammed Atta doing meeting with all the intelligence heads? In the days after 9/11, the public was told that we were going to be able to catch whoever was behind September 11th because they had engaged in record put options against American and United Airlines. But when the money trail led back to CIA-controlled companies headed up by people like Buzzy Krongard, number 3 at the CIA, the story was dropped like a hot potato. But that doesn't stop Buzzy from still going public and defending people like Osama bin Laden. He's told the Times of London and many other publications that we should just leave Osama bin Laden alone. Let him go free, that we've got a problem if we want to capture him. Prominent people across the world have been exposing the 9/11 cover-up. Michael Moore, the number 3 man in the Blair government, wrote a huge editorial for the London Guardian titled "The War on Terror is Bogus," and he pointed out that NORAD stood down on 9/11. He wrote about the Project for a New American Century, run by Jeb Bush and Dick Cheney, years before 9/11, saying that they needed a helpful terrorist attack to get the American people behind their war for empire. Meacher concluded his article by saying, if the U.S. government didn't engineer the attacks, they certainly knew about it. Andres von Bülow was German defense minister and German technology minister. I interviewed him on my syndicated radio program, and he said there's no way Al-Qaeda carried out these attacks. Only the military-industrial complex could pull it off. But here's one of the biggest pieces of evidence. You all heard them say that a paper passport fell out of one of the towers and was picked up by a police officer on the street. This plane flies into the building, explodes with jet fuel out of the guy's jacket, goes through the fireball, through the side of the plane, out of the burning building, out of the fire shooting out, and comes down to the ground unscathed. But something happened. For 6 months, they reported they had this passport. Boy, we've got it. We've got the proof. And then the guy stood up and was alive in the Middle East, and they pulled it and said, oh, that was a mistake. He wasn't a hijacker, and the story just disappeared of the passport. Because believe me, this establishment could care less about you. The EPA found all the asbestos. The EPA, guys, said that there was asbestos and people were getting sick, and there was going to be $90 million for the police and firefighters for medical treatment. And Bush came in and had that blocked. Now, that's mainstream news. And now, of the 14 search and rescue dogs, 8 of them have died from cancer. In summation, it's important to note that we only covered a tiny portion of the facts and evidence that clearly shows that 9/11 was an inside job. Number one, the official story of 9/11 has been completely disproven. At every point, we've caught them lying, manufacturing evidence, or covering up evidence. From high-level government inside sources and publicly available facts, we now have a very clear picture of how 9/11 was carried out. Number one, we know that the men who were on board the aircraft, who were supposedly the hijackers, had their houses, cars, credit cards paid for by the U.S. government. They were, in truth, agents taking part in drills and nothing more. Supposed computer malfunctions at American and United ensured that all 4 planes only had 20% occupancy on board, on a day when flights on the East Coast were an average of 80% full. Once the decoys, known as hijackers, were on board the planes, a gas was released, knocking out the occupants of the aircraft. Then a small criminal group, in control of remote control systems patented for over 20 years, took control of the aircraft and flew them into the World Trade Centers and Pentagon. The CIA-controlled drills that morning confused NORAD for over an hour until it was almost too late for them to shoot down the hijacked planes. I said almost too late. When they did find out, Dick Cheney wouldn't let the planes fly over 350 miles an hour, so 3 of the aircraft were able to hit their targets. The 4th wasn't able to because our sources in the Pentagon have told us generals didn't follow their orders and had Flight 93 shot down. If it would have hit its target, the Capitol, the government would have been completely decapitated and the president could have declared total martial law. By the grace of God, everything didn't go as planned. And so now the globalists have spent the last 3.5 years trying to cover up the sloppy job they did on 9/11. They're counting on the public not being able to face the horror of what really took place so they can carry out another, even more devastating attack and finish the job they started, enslaving America and using the country as an engine to take over the planet. The only thing that can stop them now is the American people having the courage to face the truth about 9/11 and to expose it. If we don't, they're going to continue to use problem, reaction, solution. And it's going to be sad to watch the American people after the next attack going to the very killers that carried it out, begging them to protect them. And it's sad to see the deaths of these 2,800 plus people being used to sell a police state in America. You know, Bush says the terrorists attacked us, whoever the terrorists are, because they hate our freedom. Well, then why is the government, period, whether it's George Bush or John Kerry, trying to kill our freedoms? America isn't America if we don't have these God-given freedoms. That's why this country is loved. No, now we're being forged into a tool of global empire to be launched against sovereign, innocent nations that we know had nothing to do with 9/11.
The Republicans are here and taking advantage of the 3,000 people that died right behind me for their own selfish politics, and it's very sad. I cried here for the first time today. I come here all the time. I've never cried here before. For some reason, I cried for the future because the way they're exploiting these dead people.
Because in your guts you know that the criminals are returning to the scene of the crime to gloat and to use the bloody sacrifice they committed.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So now Bush is here in the Big Apple using the deaths as an attempt to get reelected.
September 11th. September 11th, men armed with knives, armed with chemical, biological, or even nuclear weapons. The fanatics who terrorist killers, September 11th, terrorists of Al-Qaeda, terrorists, Taliban, nuclear weapons, terrorists. 9/11 terror. My fellow Americans, we have already been attacked. Terror, terrorist, evil.
September 11th, in those days after the towers fell.
September 11th. September 11th, ground zero. And suddenly the streets were full of sirens and there was fire in the sky. Terrorism, September 11th. Osama bin Laden declared war on America. September 11th, terrorists, a walking, talking weapon of mass destruction.
Barbaric terrorists, terrorists or terrorism. September 11th, September 11th. The terrorists, war and danger. September 11th, September 11th, terrorism, global terrorism, the horror. Terrorism, terrorists. Terrorists, 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 the terrorists. Terrorists, terrorist, terrorism. September 11th, global terrorism, terrorism. Terrorism. September 11th, world terrorism, terrorism. Terrorism, 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 terrorist. September 11th, threat of global terrorism, terrorism, terrorist, global terrorism, terrorism, terrorism. September 11, 2001, global terrorism. Terrorists, global terrorism, terrorism, terrorist, September 11th, terror.
Terrorism, the attack on our homeland, back from the attack on our economy, and back from the attack on our way of life. Terrorism, terrorists, hate. We must be fierce and relentless and terminate terrorism. Terrorists, you defeat them. It yearns to destroy not just the individual, but the entire international order. That's why America is safer with George W. Bush as president.
September 11th, terrorism, September 11th. Terrorism, terrorists, September 11th.
Terror, terrorist.
terrorist,
terror, September 11th, threat, tyranny, terrorist tyranny, tyranny, people hate us, terror,
Terrorism. September the 11th. Terror. Weapons of mass destruction. September the 11th. Terrorists. The